December 20th, 1943. 11:32 in the morning. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown tightened his gloved hands around the control column of his B-17 Flying Fortress as the sky over Bremen, Germany erupted without warning. Black bursts of flak exploded all around the bomber formation, sharp, violent blossoms of steel and smoke that shook the aircraft like a living thing under attack. The sound was deafening, not one explosion but hundreds, overlapping, tearing the sky apart. Charlie Brown was 21 years old. He had completed 0 combat missions. This was his first. Below them, the German anti-aircraft gunners were not ordinary soldiers pulled from reserve units. These men were officer candidate trainees, the Luftwaffe's elite marksmen, chosen for their precision and discipline. They had been waiting since early morning, tracking the American bombers as they crossed the coast, timing their approach, preparing their guns. Brown's aircraft was called Ye Olde Pub. It carried 10 men, 6,000 pounds of bombs, and the full weight of a nation's expectations. Their target was a Focke-Wulf 190 fighter factory on the outskirts of Bremen, a critical facility producing aircraft that were killing Allied pilots every day. At the pre-mission briefing, intelligence officers had warned the crews about heavy resistance. They spoke about German fighters. They spoke about flak. They spoke in numbers and probabilities. What they did not say was this. The position assigned to Ye Olde Pub was the most dangerous slot in the entire formation. The men of the 379th Bombardment Group had a name for it. They called it Purple Heart Corner. It was the exposed edge of the bomber stream, the place where defensive fire from neighboring aircraft could not overlap. German fighter pilots knew it well. They always attacked there first. New crews were often placed in that position, not by cruelty, but by cold operational logic. And Ye Olde Pub was the newest crew of all. Before Charlie Brown could even reach the bomb release point, a 20mm cannon shell exploded directly in front of the cockpit. The plexiglass nose shattered instantly. At 27,000 feet, the temperature outside was 60 degrees below zero. Wind screamed through the broken nose at over 150 miles per hour, turning the cockpit into an open freezer. Maps, papers, and debris were ripped from their places and vanished into the sky. Engine number 2 died without warning. Engine number 4 began overspeeding, its propeller threatening to tear itself free and rip the wing apart. Brown throttled it back hard, fighting to keep the bomber under control. The aircraft slowed. And just like that, the formation pulled ahead. Ye Olde Pub fell behind, alone in a hostile sky. German fighters saw it immediately. From above and behind, 12 to 15 Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s descended like wolves spotting an injured animal. They attacked in disciplined waves, firing cannon and machine guns, tearing into the bomber's aluminum skin. The attack lasted more than 10 minutes, though to the men inside it felt endless. Engine number 3 was hit and dropped to half power. The oxygen system ruptured, hissing uselessly as life-sustaining air escaped into the freezing wind. Hydraulic lines burst, spraying fluid. Electrical systems failed, plunging sections of the aircraft into darkness. The tail section was shredded by cannon fire. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, took a direct hit from a 20mm shell. He was killed instantly. There was no cry, no warning, one moment alive, the next gone. Inside the bomber, men were bleeding. Shrapnel tore through legs, arms, faces. Charlie Brown felt a sharp impact in his right shoulder as bullet fragments punched through the cockpit. Pain flared, then faded into a deep, burning numbness. The extreme cold froze the oil in the defensive guns. Of the 11 machine guns mounted on the B-17, only 3 still worked. Then the oxygen ran out. At 27,000 feet, the human brain cannot function without supplemental oxygen. Charlie Brown felt his vision narrowing, the edges of the world closing in. His hands grew numb on the controls. His thoughts slowed, became heavy, distant. Beside him, his co-pilot, Spencer Luke, slumped forward. He was unconscious. Charlie Brown's final clear thought was simple and terrifying. This is how we die. On our very first mission. Ye olde pub began to fall. The bomber dropped from 27,000 feet in an uncontrolled dive. Airspeed climbed past 300 miles per hour. The entire airframe shook violently, metal groaning under stress. At any moment, the wings could tear away from the fuselage. Then, against all logic, something happened. At roughly 1,000 feet above the ground, Charlie Brown regained consciousness. The thicker air at low altitude contained just enough oxygen to revive him. His body snapped awake in shock. He grabbed the controls and pulled back with every ounce of strength he had left. The B-17 leveled out just above the treetops of northern Germany, skimming the earth at terrifying speed. Brown looked around the cockpit. Blood was everywhere. Men were slumped in their seats, wounded, barely conscious. One crewman was dead. Others were holding pressure on injuries with frozen hands. The bomber was destroyed, barely holding together through sheer momentum and will. And then Charlie Brown realized something else. They had just flown directly over a German fighter airfield. Below them, Luftwaffe aircraft sat lined up on the tarmac. Ground crews looked up in shock as the crippled American bomber limped across the sky at barely 100 feet. On that airfield, a German fighter pilot named Franz Stigler looked up and saw ye olde pub. On the German fighter airfield below, Franz Stigler had just finished refueling his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. The morning had already been a long one. The sky over northern Germany had been crowded with American bombers since early hours, and Stigler had been in the air more than once. He had already shot down 2 B-17s that day. One more confirmed kill, just one, and he would qualify for the Knight's Cross, one of the highest military honors in Nazi Germany. Stigler was 28 years old, but he carried the fatigue of a much older man. He had flown 487 combat missions. He had been shot down 17 times. He had bailed out of burning aircraft 6 times and crash-landed damaged planes 11 more. War had tried to kill him again and again, and so far, he had survived every attempt. As ground crew stepped back from his fighter, Stigler looked up and froze. Low over the airfield, barely clearing the trees, a crippled American B-17 staggered across the sky. Its aluminum skin was shredded. Smoke trailed from its engines. It was flying so low that Stigler could clearly see the torn metal around the cockpit. This was no ordinary target. The bomber was barely alive. Stigler didn't hesitate. He climbed into his cockpit, pulled the canopy shut, and brought the engine to life. The Daimler-Benz roared as he taxied forward. Within moments, he was airborne, climbing hard and banking toward the wounded bomber. As he closed the distance, Stigler noticed something troubling. Earlier that morning, during one of his attacks, a .50 caliber bullet had lodged in his radiator. The engine temperature was already running high. He should not have taken off again. One long pursuit could cause the engine to seize. But the bomber ahead of him was too easy to ignore. As he approached from behind and below, the classic attack angle, Stigler slid his fighter into firing position. His guns were armed. His finger rested lightly on the trigger. One squeeze. That was all it would take. The Knight's Cross would be his. It would honor not just him, but his brother August, who had died in 1940 when his Junkers Ju-88 crashed during a night bombing mission over England. The medal would prove that the Stigler family had given everything to Germany. Stigler centered the gun sight on the bomber's tail. And then he saw inside. The tail gunner's compartment was destroyed. Through the massive holes torn in the fuselage, Stigler could see the body of a young American slumped forward over his machine gun. The man wasn't moving. Blood had frozen in long, dark red icicles along the shattered metal. The gun was silent. Stigler pulled closer, flying alongside the bomber. Inside, he saw wounded men moving slowly, clumsily, helping each other. One man's face was completely covered in blood. Another's leg was torn open by shrapnel. None of them were firing. None of them were fighting. They couldn't. They were just trying to stay alive. Something inside Franz Stigler shifted. He had seen death before. Plenty of it. But this felt different. Stigler remembered the words of Gustav Rodel, his former commanding officer in North Africa. Rodel had been a strict man, but he believed in a code, an old code that predated Nazi ideology, a fighter pilot's code. Rodel had once gathered his pilots and told them, "You are fighter pilots, first, last, always. If I ever hear of any of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." The message was clear. A man who could not fight back was not an enemy in combat. Killing him was not victory. It was murder. Stigler looked again at the bomber. These men weren't in parachutes, but they might as well have been. They had no working guns. No speed. No ability to defend themselves. Shooting them down would not be an act of war. It would be an execution. Stigler felt the weight of the rosary beads tucked into his flight jacket. His mother had wanted him to become a priest. He had chosen aviation instead, but he had never abandoned his faith. And his faith told him this was wrong. Slowly, deliberately, Franz Stigler lifted his finger away from the trigger. He made his decision. He would not shoot. But mercy alone was not enough. The American bomber was flying deeper into Germany, the wrong direction entirely. If it continued on its current course, it would pass over more airfields, more flak batteries, more fighter squadrons. Someone else would destroy it. Stigler pulled his fighter alongside the cockpit of the BR-17. Inside, Charlie Brown stared back at him through the shattered window. His face was pale beneath streaks of dried blood. His eyes were wide, terrified, fixed on the German pilot just feet away. Brown expected death at any second. Stigler raised his hand and pointed downward. He was signaling for the American to land, to surrender. It was the only way the crew would survive. But Brown misunderstood. To him, it looked like the German was ordering him to crash. Brown shook his head violently. Stigler tried again. This time, he pointed north, toward Sweden. Neutral territory. Internment, yes, but survival. Still, Brown didn't understand. The bomber kept flying west, limping toward the North Sea. Franz Stigler realized something then, with sudden clarity. If he broke away now, the Americans would die. Maybe not immediately. Maybe not by him. But they would die all the same. And he would carry that knowledge for the rest of his life. Stigler understood the risk of what he was about to do. In Nazi Germany, allowing an enemy aircraft to escape was treason. A Luftwaffe pilot caught escorting an American bomber could face court-martial and execution, no appeal, no mercy. He knew the rules. And he chose to break them. Franz Stigler made the most dangerous decision of his life. He would not only spare the American bomber. He would protect it. He maneuvered his Messerschmitt into tight formation alongside the B-17's left wing, so close that the two aircraft were separated by only a few feet. From the ground, their silhouettes blended together, almost appearing as a single shape in the sky. It was a desperate gamble. German ground crews knew that the Luftwaffe occasionally flew captured B-17s for training and special missions. Seeing a German fighter escorting one might delay a flak crew just long enough. Inside Ye Olde Pub, Charlie Brown watched the German fighter slide into position beside him. He ordered his top turret gunner to aim, but not fire. Brown didn't understand what was happening. Was this a trick? Was the German calling for reinforcements? Was he waiting for the perfect moment to strike? Minute after minute passed. The German fighter stayed with them. And Charlie Brown began to realize something incredible. The man who should have killed them was choosing not to. The B-17 limped forward at barely more than 100 miles per hour, flying so low that treetops blurred beneath its nose. Inside Ye Olde Pub, no one spoke. The roar of damaged engines and the scream of wind through the shattered cockpit filled every space where words might have been. Charlie Brown kept his eyes forward, but he was acutely aware of the German fighter pacing him off the left wing. It was still there. Not behind them. Not above them. But beside them. close enough that Brown could see the pilot's helmet, the markings on the aircraft, even the way the sun glinted off the canopy glass. Every instinct Brown had screamed that this was impossible. German fighters did not fly formation with American bombers. German fighters killed American bombers. Yet minute after minute passed, and the attack never came. Inside the bomber, the crew struggled just to remain conscious. The oxygen system was gone. The heat was gone. Frost crept into fingers and toes, stiffening joints and slowing movements. Blood pooled and froze on the floor where wounded men lay strapped into their positions. In the waist section, crewmen pressed rags and gloved hands against torn flesh, knowing it wasn't enough, but having nothing else to offer. Morphine syrettes were useless, frozen solid in the cold. Pain had to be endured in silence. In the cockpit, Brown felt his damaged engines vibrating unevenly beneath him. Engine number 2 was dead. Engine number 3 produced barely half power. Engine number 4 surged unpredictably, threatening to fail at any moment. Only engine number 1 was healthy. 1.5 engines were holding a 40,000-pound aircraft in the air. And yet, they were moving. The German fighter stayed with them. From the ground, villagers and soldiers alike looked up in disbelief. The shattered B-17 was an obvious enemy aircraft, but the Messerschmitt flying inches from its wing gave pause. Anti-aircraft gunners hesitated. Orders were delayed. Fingers hovered uncertainly above triggers. Franz Stigler flew rigidly beside the bomber, his jaw clenched. Every second was a risk. Any flak gunner could decide to fire anyway. Any German fighter could appear and question what he was doing. One radio call could end his life. But Stigler held position. He flew so close that if the Americans were hit, he would be hit too. That was the point. Inside the bomber, Charlie Brown began to understand that this was no trick. The German was protecting them. Brown glanced sideways again. The pilot met his eyes. There was no hatred there. No cruelty. Only concentration, and something else Brown couldn't quite name. Resolve. They passed over villages. Over narrow roads packed with military trucks. Over farm fields dusted with frost. The world below was unmistakably Germany, and every mile deeper into enemy territory made survival less likely. Then, at last, the coastline appeared ahead. The North Sea. A grey, frozen expanse stretching to the horizon. For Charlie Brown, it was both hope and terror. If they reached it, the Luftwaffe's inland defenses would be behind them. But once over the water, there would be nowhere to land. If the bomber failed, there would be no rescue. The water temperature in December was barely above freezing. A man thrown into it would live only minutes. Stigler knew he could not escort them much farther. His fuel was running low. The bullet lodged in his radiator still threatened to seize the engine without warning. If he followed them across the sea, he would never make it back. And if he landed in Britain, he would spend the rest of the war in a prison camp if he was lucky. But first, they had to clear the coastal defenses. The German Atlantic wall stretched along the shoreline, radar stations, observer posts, flak batteries positioned to destroy any aircraft attempting to cross. A damaged American bomber flying low and slow should have been an easy kill. Stigler moved even closer. So close that his wingtip nearly brushed the bomber's fuselage. From the ground, the two aircraft merged into a single shape, German fighter escorting what could plausibly be a captured bomber on a test or transfer flight. Radar operators saw two aircraft in formation. No alarms were raised. No guns fired. Charlie Brown watched the coastline slide beneath them, scarcely daring to breathe. They crossed the beach. They were over water. Stigler had done the impossible. He had escorted an enemy bomber through the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. Now, it was time to leave. Stigler pulled his fighter slightly forward, aligning his cockpit with the shattered nose of the BR-17 one final time. Charlie Brown turned and looked directly at him. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Two men, both young, both exhausted, both shaped by a war they did not create, stared at each other across a few feet of cold air. Neither spoke. Neither smiled. Franz Stigler raised his right hand. He brought it to his forehead in a formal salute. Charlie Brown froze, unsure how to respond. Then the German pilot banked gently to the left. The Messerschmitt peeled away, climbing into the grey sky, shrinking until it became a dark speck and then vanished entirely. Charlie Brown watched until it was gone. He did not understand what had just happened. He only knew that the man who should have killed him had chosen not to. But the ordeal was far from over. Ahead lay 250 miles of open sea. Behind them, Germany faded into cloud. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the crew braced themselves for the longest flight of their lives. The bomber staggered westward, engines coughing and shuddering. Brown checked his instruments again and again, calculating in his head. Airspeed hovered around 140 miles per hour, dangerously close to stall speed. Any loss of power could send them into the water. He nudged the throttles forward, coaxing every ounce of strength from the damaged engines. The aircraft protested, shuddering, but held. Behind him, men fought shock, blood loss, and the creeping numbness of cold. One man's leg wound continued to bleed despite pressure. Another had lost all feeling in his feet. A radio operator worked with one eye nearly blind, tapping out distress signals into the void. No response came. The North Sea stretched endlessly below. Brown knew the math. At their speed, the crossing would take nearly 2 hours. 2 hours in an aircraft that was barely flying. 2 hours over water that would kill them in minutes. Charlie Brown tightened his grip on the controls. He could not let go. Not now. 9 lives depended on him. And somewhere behind them, a German pilot was returning to his airfield, carrying a secret that could cost him everything, yet knowing he had done what was right. The bomber pressed on into the grey horizon, alone once more, but alive. For now. The North Sea showed no mercy. Below the bomber, grey water rolled endlessly, broken only by whitecaps and the occasional dark shadow of waves colliding. There were no ships in sight. No friendly fighters. No landmarks. Just cold, hostile emptiness stretching from horizon to horizon. Inside Ye Olde Pub, time lost meaning. Minutes felt like hours. Hours stretched into something heavier, an endurance test measured in pain, fear, and stubborn will. Charlie Brown's hands were numb on the controls. He flexed his fingers repeatedly, fighting stiffness, afraid that if he stopped moving, he might not be able to start again. The cockpit glass was rimmed with ice, narrowing his view to a frozen tunnel pointed west. Every few minutes, Brown checked the engines. Engine 1 still held steady. Engine 3 fluctuated wildly. Engine 4 coughed and sputtered like a dying animal. The bomber vibrated constantly, each shudder a reminder that the aircraft was not meant to fly like this, low, slow, wounded. Behind the cockpit, the crew was deteriorating. One of the waist gunners drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and irregular. Another man's hands were so frostbitten he could no longer feel them. The flight engineer moved through the aircraft with painful slowness, checking systems that barely functioned, knowing full well that there were no repairs left to make. They were no longer fighting the enemy. They were fighting physics. Brown recalculated fuel consumption again. The numbers were tight, terrifyingly tight, but still possible. If nothing else failed. If the winds did not worsen. If luck held. Luck, he thought grimly, had already been spent over Bremen. The bomber continued west. At one point, engine 4 backfired violently, sending a tremor through the entire airframe. Brown felt his heart jump into his throat. He eased the throttle back, whispering to the machine as if it were alive. Just hold together. Just a little longer. The engine steadied, but only barely. Hours later, though it felt like a lifetime, the horizon began to change. The flat grey line ahead darkened. Clouds thinned. And then, faint and unmistakable, a smudge of land appeared. England. No one cheered. No one celebrated. They were too exhausted, too broken, too aware that the bomber could still betray them at any moment. British radar stations picked up the crippled aircraft long before it reached the coast. Controllers watched in disbelief as the slow-moving contact crept toward them, its altitude dangerously low, its signature unstable. Orders were issued cautiously. RAF fighters scrambled, not to attack, but to identify. When the first Spitfire slid into view off the bomber's wing, the American crew flinched instinctively, old habits overriding reason. But the British pilot simply rocked his wings and held position. He had never seen anything like this. A B-17 riddled with holes, missing entire sections of fuselage, limping home on borrowed time. The bomber crossed the English coastline and headed inland. Below them, green fields replaced grey water. Villages appeared. Roads. Church steeples. Charlie Brown felt something tighten in his chest. They had made it. But they were not finished yet. Brown knew he could not keep the aircraft in the air much longer. Landing gear damage meant a normal landing might collapse the plane entirely. Hydraulic systems were unreliable. Brakes were questionable at best. They needed a long runway. A very long runway. Controllers vectored the bomber toward RAF Seething, a bomber base with sufficient length and emergency crews standing by. As Ye Olde Pub descended, smoke trailing from its engines, every eye on the base turned skyward. Ground crews stopped what they were doing. Medics ran toward the runway. Fire trucks rolled into position. The bomber came in low and slow, barely above stall speed. Brown lined up the runway with painstaking care, knowing that any correction might be too much. The landing gear groaned as it extended. It locked. Barely. Brown brought the nose down gently. The main wheels touched first, harder than he wanted, but controlled. The aircraft bounced once, then slammed back onto the runway. Metal shrieked. Sparks flew. The bomber rolled. And rolled. And rolled. The brakes responded sluggishly, unevenly. Brown fought the rudder pedals, keeping the aircraft straight as long as he could. Finally, mercifully, the bomber ground to a halt, shuddering one last time before falling silent. For a moment, there was nothing. Then the engines died. The sudden quiet was overwhelming. Charlie Brown sat frozen in the cockpit, his hands still gripping the controls, his body trembling now that the fight was over. He did not move until a ground crewman climbed up and pounded on the fuselage, shouting words Brown could not hear. The crew began to stir. Men unstrapped themselves and stumbled toward exits, some collapsing the moment their feet touched solid ground. Medics rushed in, carrying stretchers, administering oxygen, cutting away frozen clothing. Of the 9 men aboard, all survived. Doctors later said it bordered on impossible. When intelligence officers questioned Brown about the mission, they expected the usual report: flak, fighters, damage, survival. What they did not expect was the story he told next. Brown described the German fighter. The way it had flown beside them. The way it had refused to fire. The salute. The officers exchanged glances. Then one of them leaned forward and spoke quietly. "You will not discuss this with anyone." Brown frowned. "So, if word gets out that a German fighter escorted you home, some of our own men might try to repay the favor. We can't afford that." Brown understood. The story was classified, not officially, but effectively buried. He complied. The war went on. Charlie Brown flew more missions, though never again with Ye Olde Public. He survived the war, carried the memory with him, and tried to make sense of it in the years that followed. Across the ocean, Franz Stigler landed his damaged fighter and said nothing. He filed his report carefully. No mention of the bomber. No mention of the escort. No mention of mercy. To speak of it would have been to invite a court-martial, or worse. Stigler flew again. And again. He survived the war as well. Decades passed. The world rebuilt itself. And yet, 2 men, on opposite sides of history, were connected forever by a decision made high above Germany on a freezing December day. A decision that defied orders. A decision that defied war itself. Neither of them knew then that the story was not finished. That destiny, patient and relentless, would one day bring them face to face again. Not as enemies, but as something far rarer to survive a war. Human beings. For decades, the moment remained frozen in Charlie Brown's mind. The German fighter. The steady wing. The salute. It replayed itself in quiet moments, on long drives, during sleepless nights, in the spaces between conversations where memory has room to breathe. Brown never spoke of it publicly. Not because he was afraid, but because he had been ordered not to, and because, in some strange way, the story felt too fragile to expose. War had taught him that good things rarely survived contact with bureaucracy. After 1945, life moved on. Brown left the Army Air Forces, married, built a family, and pursued a civilian career. He laughed, raised children, paid bills, and tried to live like a man who had not once stared death in the face at 20,000 feet. To most people, he was an ordinary American veteran. But inside, the question never faded. Why? Why had that German pilot spared them? Brown knew the logic of war. He had killed when ordered. He had watched friends die. Mercy did not fit the equation. And yet, it had happened. Across the Atlantic, Franz Stigler carried his own silence. He, too, survived the war, though not without scars, physical and otherwise. The Luftwaffe he had once served was gone. Germany lay shattered. Stigler emigrated, first to Venezuela and later to Canada, where he rebuilt his life far from the ruins of Europe. Like Brown, he spoke little of the war. Unlike many veterans, Stigler did not boast. He did not romanticize. He had seen too much. He had lost too many friends. And one memory, in particular, followed him like a shadow. The bomber. He remembered every detail. The torn fuselage. The wounded men visible through the holes. The young pilot's eyes. Stigler had been raised on a code of honor taught by a former World War I ace: you do not shoot a man who cannot defend himself. That is not combat. That is murder. That lesson had guided his hand that day. But for years, he wondered if it had mattered. Did the bomber crash anyway? Did the crew drown in the North Sea? Had his mercy changed anything at all? He would never know. Until, one day, he decided to look. In the late 1980s, Charlie Brown attended a reunion of the 379th Bomb Group. Surrounded by aging men with thinning hair and stiff joints, he felt the weight of time pressing in. Stories were exchanged, some humorous, some painful, but all incomplete. During one conversation, Brown finally spoke. He told the story. Not as rumor. Not as legend. But as fact. A German fighter had escorted his bomber to the coast and let them go. The room fell quiet. At first, there was disbelief. Then curiosity. Then something deeper, recognition that they had all lived long enough to hear a story that challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy. Encouraged, Brown went further. He placed ads in aviation magazines and veteran newsletters. His message was simple. I'm looking for the German pilot who escorted my BA-17 out of Germany on December 20, 1943. If you are that pilot, or know him, please contact me. For years, there was no reply. Then, in 1990, a letter arrived. The handwriting was neat. The English careful. It began. I was the pilot. Brown's hands trembled as he read. Franz Stigler described the mission from his side, the scramble, the damaged fighter, the moment he lined up behind the bomber and saw the wounded crew. He described his decision, his escort, and the salute. Every detail matched. There was no doubt. The impossible had found a voice. The two men began corresponding, exchanging letters filled with memories, questions, and a cautious warmth that grew with every page. What began as curiosity became respect. Respect became something closer to friendship. Finally, they agreed to meet. The meeting took place in Vancouver, Canada. Charlie Brown walked into the room not knowing what to expect. He was no longer the young pilot fighting frost and fear. He was an old man, his steps slower, his hair grey. Across the room stood Franz Stigler. Older. Smaller than memory. But unmistakable. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Brown extended his hand. Stigler took it. The two men stood there, hands clasped, eyes locked, not as former enemies, but as survivors of the same storm. Brown broke the silence. "You saved my life." Stigler shook his head gently. "No," he said. "I did what was right." They talked for hours. They compared memories of the flight, filling in gaps neither had known existed. Brown described the injuries, the failing engines, the terror of the sea crossing. Stigler spoke of the fear of flak, the risk of being reported, the certainty that he would be executed if discovered. Both men realized how close the story had come to ending differently. How easily mercy could have vanished. From that day forward, they remained close. They visited schools together. Spoke at veteran events. Told their story not as propaganda, but as testimony that even in war, humanity can survive. Brown once said that Franz Stigler was as close as a brother. Stigler returned the sentiment. When asked years later why he had not fired, Stigler answered simply, "I could not shoot at men who were already defeated." Charlie Brown lived to old age, carrying gratitude instead of bitterness. Franz Stigler did the same, content in the knowledge that one decision had echoed across a lifetime. Both men passed away within months of each other in 2008. Their story outlived them. Today, it stands as one of the most extraordinary episodes of World War II aviation, not because of victory or destruction, but because of restraint. In a war defined by annihilation, two pilots chose something else. One chose mercy. The other chose survival. And together, without ever speaking a word in the sky, they proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, a single act of conscience can still rise above the noise of war.